The crowd of engineers stood in silence, shaking their heads in defeat. The massive engine, worth millions, lay dead in the center of the workshop. "It's impossible," one of them muttered, tossing his gloves aside. The wealthy owner sneered, already preparing to cut his losses, until a frail figure stepped forward. A 70-year-old man, his hands scarred and trembling from a lifetime of labor, held up nothing but an old rusty wrench. The room erupted in laughter. How could this worn-out mechanic succeed where the brightest minds had failed? But what no one knew was that this old man carried something far more powerful than tools. He carried experience, scars, and the pride of a lifetime spent fixing what others abandoned. And soon, he would silence them all. Frank Miller was 70 years old, but every wrinkle on his face told a story of sweat, oil, and iron. His life had been written in grease-stained overalls and calloused hands, not in books or offices. He was the kind of man who woke up before sunrise, drank his coffee black, and spent his days inside his small, dusty garage on the edge of town. The garage itself was a reflection of him, humble, worn, yet full of life. The faded sign that read, "Miller's Auto Repairs," hung crooked above the rusting doors. Inside, old tractors, pickup trucks, and farm equipment filled the space, waiting for Frank's touch. Most people passed by without giving it a glance. After all, newer, shinier repair shops had popped up in the city, full of computers, diagnostic machines, and young mechanics who boasted about their degrees. But for the farmers and truckers who knew Frank, he was more than just a mechanic. He was a savior. Frank had spent his entire life working with machines. As a boy, he fixed bicycles for his neighbors. As a teenager, he repaired tractors at his father's farm. When Vietnam came, he became the guy soldiers relied on to keep their vehicles running in the mud and chaos of war. After the war, he came home and built a reputation. No matter how broken the machine, Frank found a way. Not with fancy equipment, but with instinct, patience, and a stubborn refusal to quit. Still, the years had not been kind to him.
His body was slower, his back ached, and his small-town garage barely made enough to pay bills. His wife had passed away years earlier, and his grown children lived far away, chasing lives in cities that never cared for men like Frank. Yet, despite the loneliness, Frank never stopped working. To him, fixing engines wasn't just a job. It was his way of staying alive, of holding on to dignity in a world that was moving too fast and leaving men like him behind.
Sometimes, when he closed the garage at night, he would sit on an old wooden stool, staring at his hands. They shook more than they used to, and he wondered how much longer he could keep going. But then, he'd hear the rumble of a truck on the highway, or a farmer's laughter in the distance, and he'd smile. Machines needed him, and as long as someone needed him, he'd keep fighting. What Frank didn't know was that his quiet, ordinary days were about to collide with arrogance, humiliation, and the greatest test of his life. A test that would force him to prove once again that experience and heart could outshine all the money and education in the world. It was a hot Saturday morning when Frank's quiet life was interrupted. A convoy of shiny black trucks and luxury cars rolled into town, their engines humming like lions marking their territory. People peeked out from shops and diners as the caravan stopped right in front of Frank's dusty little garage. Out stepped Richard Hayes, a wealthy businessman in his early 40s. Tall, confident, and dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, Richard carried himself like a man who had never heard the word no. Behind him, a group of young engineers in crisp white shirts and polished shoes followed, carrying clipboards and laptops. "Is this the place?" one of them asked, wrinkling his nose at the smell of oil and dust. Richard smirked. "Yeah, this must be Miller's Auto. My father used to talk about this old man. Let's see what's left of him." Frank wiped his greasy hands on a rag as the group approached. His heart sank when he saw them, not because he was intimidated, but because he already knew their type. Men with money, men with pride, men who looked at him and saw nothing more than a relic. "Mr. Miller," Richard said loudly, so the small crowd that had gathered outside could hear. "I hear you used to be a good mechanic. Some even called you the best. But times have changed. Machines today aren't like the tractors you grew up fixing. You're out of your league." The engineers chuckled, whispering among themselves. Frank simply looked at Richard, calm, his blue eyes tired but steady. "A machine is a machine," he said. "It don't matter how new or old. It's about knowing how it breathes, how it feels." Richard laughed, a sharp, cruel sound. "Breathes? Feels? Listen to this nonsense. Gentlemen, this is why these old-timers don't belong in the modern world." One of the engineers held up a tablet. "We already ran diagnostics, Mr. Hayes. The machine can't be fixed. It's too complex. Even the company that built it said it's beyond repair." Richard turned back to Frank, his smile widening. "See? Even trained professionals can't do it. And yet, here you are, an old man with shaky hands, claiming you know better." Frank didn't answer. He knew better than to fight arrogance with words. But Richard wasn't done. He raised his voice, speaking so everyone nearby could hear. "I'll tell you what, old man. If you're so confident, why don't you prove it? Fix the engine my team gave up on. Do that, and I'll pay you more money than you've seen in your life. But fail." He paused, smirking. "And you'll prove once and for all what you really are. A washed-up, useless fossil clinging to the past." Laughter erupted from the engineers. Some passers-by shook their heads, while others looked at Frank with pity. His cheeks burned, not from shame, but from the sting of disrespect. Frank tightened his grip on the rag in his hand, his jaw clenching. He didn't need Richard's money. What he needed was respect. And this arrogant man had just stepped on the one thing Frank had left. What Frank didn't know was that this humiliation was only the beginning. The challenge Richard was about to place before him wasn't just difficult. It was designed to break him in front of everyone. Richard Hayes led Frank and the small crowd to the massive machine parked at the edge of town. It wasn't a car or a tractor. It was a colossal industrial generator brought in from one of Richard's construction sites. The thing looked like a beast, its steel casing dented, bolts scattered, cables torn. Even standing still, it had a kind of menace, like a sleeping giant that refused to wake. "This," Richard announced proudly, "is the heart of my company's biggest project. Without it, my operations are losing thousands of dollars every single hour. My engineers have worked day and night on it, but as you can see," he gestured to the pile of broken parts lying on the ground, "it's beyond saving." The young engineers nodded in agreement, one of them adding, "We tried everything. Software resets, system overrides, even replacement parts. Nothing works. It's finished." Richard turned to Frank, smirking. "So, old man, do you still think your magic wrench can fix what trained minds and advanced technology could not?" Frank didn't answer right away. He stepped closer, running his hand along the cool metal of the generator. He listened, not to the laughter behind him, but to the silence of the machine. Every dent, every scratch, every trace of wear spoke to him like words on a page. "Where others see metal," Frank finally said, "I see a story. This thing isn't dead. It's just misunderstood." The engineers rolled their eyes, and Richard burst into laughter. "Misunderstood? This isn't some old pickup truck, Miller. This is a modern industrial engine worth more than your entire garage. You're out of your depth." But Frank had already crouched down, inspecting the wiring, smelling the faint burn of overheated circuits. He picked up a small bolt from the ground and turned it between his fingers. Something clicked in his mind. He didn't know exactly how yet, but he sensed the machine wasn't gone. It was waiting for the right touch. "Give me my tools," Frank said quietly. Richard raised his eyebrows. "Oh, so the circus begins." He turned to his men. "Gentlemen, step back and enjoy the show. Watch as this old fool embarrasses himself in front of the whole town." The engineers laughed again, folding their arms, certain of what was about to happen. Meanwhile, townsfolk began to gather, whispering to each other. Some were curious. Others pitied Frank. A few, old farmers who remembered what he had done for them in the past, silently prayed he'd prove them wrong. Frank walked back to his rusty pickup and returned with a battered toolbox. Every piece inside it was old, worn, and stained with history. His wrench had been with him since his army days, the handle wrapped with faded tape, To anyone else, it looked like junk. To Frank, it was an extension of his own hands. He laid the tools on the ground, his movements steady, his eyes sharp. But inside, he felt the weight of the challenge. He wasn't just fighting a machine. He was fighting time, arrogance, and his own body that no longer obeyed as it once had. And as he knelt before the broken generator, the whispers around him grew louder. Richard's voice cut through them all. "Go ahead, Miller. Show us how a 70-year-old with shaky hands plans to do what the best minds in the business could not. Show us all how failure looks up close." Frank inhaled deeply, steadying his nerves. He placed the wrench against the first bolt. This wasn't just about fixing a machine anymore. It was about proving that he still mattered in a world trying to erase him. But what Frank didn't know was that his road to redemption would be filled with ridicule, sabotage, and pain before he'd ever reach victory. Frank worked in silence, his hands moving slowly but surely across the giant machine. The crowd grew larger, with townsfolk circling the site, whispering among themselves. Some wanted to believe in him. Others came only to watch a spectacle. At first, everything seemed calm. Frank tightened bolts, cleaned clogged filters, and adjusted wires with the precision of a surgeon. He hummed softly to himself, the way he always did when solving a puzzle. For a moment there was hope, like maybe, just maybe, the old man could pull off a miracle. But Richard wasn't going to let him have that moment. "Look at this!" Richard shouted loud enough for everyone to hear. "He's poking around like a farmer fixing a lawnmower. Gentlemen, this is what passes for genius in small towns." Laughter erupted from the engineers. One of them whispered to another, "He doesn't even have diagnostic software, he's guessing." Frank ignored them, but their voices dug into him. His hands trembled as he reached deeper into the machine. Sweat rolled down his forehead, and his back ached from bending over. Still, he pressed on. He found a section of wiring burned and brittle, a clue. Carefully, he patched it with a piece of copper he'd kept in his toolbox. The crowd held its breath as Frank connected the last wire and signaled for the power switch. The engine coughed once, then twice. For a heartbeat, the machine growled like it wanted to live again. Eyes widened. Farmers in the back muttered prayers. Then, bang! A loud crack echoed through the yard. Sparks flew from the machine, and black smoke poured out like a dying beast. The generator shuddered violently before falling silent again. Dead. The silence that followed was brutal. And then came the laughter. It started with Richard, a booming, arrogant laugh that cut Frank like a blade. "There it is. I told you all. The old man's nothing but a fraud." He clapped his hands, and his engineers joined in, chuckling, shaking their heads, mocking every move Frank had made. One of them shouted, "Hey, Miller, maybe you should stick to tractors. Leave the real machines to us." Another added, "Careful, old man, you'll hurt yourself trying to play mechanic." Even some of the townsfolk, those who had come hoping for a miracle, began shaking their heads in disappointment. A young boy whispered to his father, "Why is everyone laughing at him?" The father didn't answer. Frank stood frozen. His chest felt heavy, his ears rang with humiliation. His trembling hands clutched the wrench, but he no longer had the strength to lift it. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but his throat was dry. Richard walked closer, his voice dripping with venom. "You see, folks, this is the reality. Experience doesn't matter anymore. This man is a relic. He's been left behind, just like his rusty tools and dusty garage." He leaned in, lowering his voice so only Frank could hear. "You should have stayed in the shadows, old man. Now everyone knows you're finished." The words burned. Frank's pride, his last treasure, had been shattered in front of the entire town. He turned away from the broken machine, his eyes cast down. For the first time in his life, he wondered if maybe Richard was right. But deep inside, beneath the pain and shame, a small fire still burned. A voice whispering, "You've been here before. You've been broken, mocked, forgotten, and every time you came back." Frank didn't know it yet, but this moment, this fall into humiliation, wasn't the end. It was the spark that would ignite the fight of his life. That night, after the crowd had gone home and the engineers had left laughing, Frank sat alone in his garage. The humiliation replayed in his mind. The smoke, the sparks, the sound of Richard's cruel laughter. For a moment he thought about quitting. Maybe Richard was right. Maybe the world had no use for men like him anymore. But then his eyes fell on the wrench lying on his workbench. The same wrench he had carried since Vietnam. The same wrench that had saved countless engines, tractors and trucks when people thought they were beyond repair. He picked it up, held it tight, and whispered, "Not yet. I'm not done yet." Frank returned to the generator in the dead of night. The construction site was empty, the machine still silent and broken. He set down his old toolbox, lit a small lamp, and got to work. There was no one to mock him now, no one to laugh at his shaking hands. Just him and the machine. He started from scratch. Every wire, every bolt, every pipe. He inspected them all, slowly, carefully, like reading the pages of a book. He listened with his ears pressed against the steel, feeling the faint vibrations, smelling the burned oil. Machines spoke to him, not with words, but with whispers. And this one was crying for someone who understood. Hours passed. Sweat dripped down his back. His hands grew raw from twisting bolts and stripping wires. His knees ached from kneeling on the hard ground. But Frank didn't stop. Every failure only pushed him harder. He remembered nights in the jungle when soldiers depended on him to bring a dead engine back to life under enemy fire. If he could do it then, he could do it now. At one point, exhaustion almost knocked him down. His hands shook so badly he dropped his wrench. He sat back, gasping, looking up at the dark sky. "Lord," he whispered, "I can't do this alone." And in that silence, something stirred in him. A memory, his father's voice saying, "A machine will always tell you what it needs, son. You just gotta listen close enough." With renewed determination, Frank went back at it. He improvised, using old copper wire from his toolbox, carving a gasket from a piece of rubber hose, tightening bolts with precision only decades of practice could give. He worked like a man possessed, not for money, not for glory, but for his dignity. By dawn, Frank's shirt was soaked in sweat, his hands bleeding from cuts and burns. But when he looked at the generator, it no longer looked like a dead beast. It looked like a sleeping giant, ready to rise. He wasn't finished yet, but he was close. And though no one was there to see it, Frank smiled. Because he knew, come the moment of truth, he would make that machine roar again. But what Frank didn't know was that Richard wasn't done either. He had plans to ensure the old man would fail again, plans that would push Frank to the very edge of defeat before the world saw what he was truly made of. The sun rose over the construction site, casting long shadows across the broken generator. Richard Hayes returned with his entourage of engineers, confident the old man had given up. But to his surprise, Frank was already there, covered in grease, his face tired but determined. "Well, well," Richard smirked, adjusting his expensive watch. "The fossil is still here. Did you sleep out in the dirt with your precious toy? Tell me, Miller, did you finally realize it's hopeless?" Frank didn't answer. He simply wiped his hands on a rag and stood in front of the machine. His eyes were red from exhaustion, his arms sore, but his spirit was unshaken. "It's ready," he said firmly. Laughter broke out among the engineers. One of them pointed at Frank's toolbox and sneered, "With those antique tools? You've got to be kidding." Richard shook his head. "All right, old man. If you want to embarrass yourself again, go ahead. But this time, when it fails, everyone will know you're finished." The crowd from the day before had gathered again. Farmers, workers, townsfolk. Some were curious, others skeptical. Yet there was something different in the air this time. The way Frank stood, the way his hands rested steady on the wrench. There was no doubt in his posture. Frank knelt down and placed the final bolt. He checked the copper patch he had installed, tightened the improvised gasket, and double-checked the wiring. Every move was slow, deliberate, confident. He then looked at one of the workers standing by the power switch. "Turn it on," Frank said. The switch was flipped. For a moment, Nothing happened. The silence was so heavy you could hear the mocking whispers start again. Richard smirked, preparing to speak. And then it came. A low rumble, a spark of life. The generator shuddered, then growled. Black smoke hissed out, but this time, instead of dying, the machine roared louder. The ground vibrated as the massive engine came alive, pistons firing, gears turning, metal singing like thunder. The crowd gasped. Some cheered, others stood in stunned silence. Frank's eyes lit up, and for the first time in years he felt young again. The beast had risen. Against every prediction, against every insult, the machine was alive. Richard's smug smile froze on his face. He turned to his engineers. What did he do? This isn't possible." The young men scrambled with their tablets, checking diagnostics. One stammered, It's running at full capacity, better than before. He actually fixed it." The crowd erupted. Farmers clapped, workers whistled, and even children shouted in awe. Frank stood tall, his chest swelling with pride. He didn't need to say a word, the machine spoke for him. And in that moment, every laugh, every insult, every humiliation was washed away by the deafening roar of victory. But Frank knew the battle wasn't over. Richard's pride wouldn't let him accept defeat so easily, and what came next would be the final showdown, where respect would either be restored forever or crushed once and for all. The generator roared like a living beast, its vibrations shaking the ground beneath everyone's feet. People cheered, clapped, and shouted Frank's name. For the first time in years, the old mechanic wasn't invisible. He was the man of the hour. But Richard Hayes wasn't ready to admit defeat. His face burned red with anger as he pushed through the crowd. This is a trick," he shouted. "He probably patched it up just enough to make it run for a few minutes. It'll break down again. You'll see." The crowd went quiet, eyes shifting between Richard and Frank. Frank wiped his hands on his rag, looked at Richard calmly and said, "Then let's see how long it lasts." Minutes passed. The machine ran smooth as silk. Not a hiccup, not a shudder. The engineers frantically tapped their tablets, whispering to each other in disbelief. It's operating at peak efficiency. He didn't just fix it, he improved it." The farmers in the crowd erupted with applause. "That's Miller for you," one of them shouted. "Fixed my tractor the same way when no one else could." Richard's jaw clenched. He turned back to the crowd, desperate to salvage his pride. "Don't cheer too soon. Anyone could have gotten lucky." But a voice rang out from the back. "Luck doesn't build a machine from scraps," another added. "Luck doesn't keep it running stronger than before." Soon voices rose together. "Respect the man. Frank did it. The old man showed you all." The chants grew louder, drowning out Richard's protests. His empire of arrogance was crumbling before his eyes. Frank, meanwhile, stood humbly by the machine, his wrench still in his hand. He didn't gloat, didn't mock, didn't need to. The truth was plain for all to see. He had done the impossible. One boy ran up to him, eyes wide with admiration. "Mr. Miller, when I grow up, I want to fix machines like you." Frank smiled softly, patting the boy on the shoulder. "Then listen, son. Don't let anyone tell you you're too small, too old, or not good enough. If you've got heart, you've already got more than most." The crowd applauded again, louder than before. For the first time, Frank felt what he had been missing all these years. Not just respect, but honor. His dignity, stripped away by arrogance and laughter, was now restored before the entire town. Richard, humiliated, stormed off to his car, his engineers trailing behind him in silence. The man who had come to expose Frank as a relic left as the one exposed instead, a fool blinded by pride. And as the crowd lifted Frank onto their shoulders, chanting his name, one truth rang louder than the machine's roar. Experience, grit, and dignity had triumphed over arrogance and wealth. When the crowd finally settled and the machine hummed steadily in the background, Frank sat on a wooden crate outside his garage. The evening sun painted the sky orange and gold, and for the first time in years, his heart felt light. He thought back to the humiliation, the laughter, the sting of Richard's words. He thought about the long, lonely nights spent fighting with bolts and wires, about the sweat, the pain in his hands, the voices of doubt in his head. And then he looked at the machine, alive, strong, working better than ever. It wasn't just a machine he had fixed. It was himself. For so long, Frank had believed he was forgotten, a relic left behind in a world that worshipped youth, money, and technology. But today proved something different. Age wasn't weakness. It was experience. Scars weren't shame. They were proof of survival. And dignity wasn't given. It was earned again and again by refusing to bow down to arrogance. Richard had left in silence, his pride broken. But Frank didn't need revenge. The real victory wasn't humiliating Richard. It was proving to himself, and to everyone who doubted, that he still mattered. Frank looked at his old wrench resting beside him. He smiled. "Guess we're not done yet, old friend." He turned to the crowd still lingering nearby, people who had once pitied him, but now looked at him with admiration. With a gentle but firm voice, he said, "Never let anyone tell you you're finished. As long as you've got heart, as long as you're willing to fight, you've still got something left to give." The crowd clapped, some with tears in their eyes. "And now, dear listener, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been treated like Frank? Humiliated, underestimated, made to feel useless? Share your story in the comments. I want to hear it. And if you believe that experience will always beat arrogance, hit that like button right now. Because stories like this aren't just about machines. They're about life, dignity, and redemption. They deserve to be told, remembered, and shared. So subscribe, join me for the next story, and never forget, true strength doesn't fade with age, it only grows.